Hello and welcome to Season 6, Episode 9 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And we are, of course, reading James Hitchcock's History of the Catholic Church, going chapter by chapter to break down the history of the Catholic Church through the ages. Now, we're still in the Middle Ages, breaking down part 2 of the chapter on Christendom, sort of coming out of the Dark Ages last chapter, moving into sort of more growth and more spiritual thinking in the Church this time.
Yeah, and this second half of this section is probably the most important development of the intellectual development of the Catholic Church and theology, and it
really just
plows right through it.
Yeah, the development of kind of just Western science and
that's true
and
too.
Reasoning.
The beginning of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
After that was some sort of. Did I come through in the program? That's great. Yeah, because they rediscovered Aristotle, but I don't want to steal the thunder of our podcast.
No, absolutely.
But that's a big part of it.
Yes.
And it makes you wonder, like, of course, I talk about these things every once in a while. Like you listen to these other podcasts and read different things, and there's like theories about ancient civilizations that were more advanced than ours, and we just don't even. It's like almost like we're going to wait to rediscover what people have already knew thousands of years ago. Like we don't really understand how the Egyptians were able to move the stone the way they did without modern machinery. Maybe they had some sort of really cool thing that we just don't understand now.
Yeah. I think it was water. That's what I've heard.
Water, or have you heard like vibrations?
I have not heard vibrations. What?
You can move things through sound.
Well, yeah. How would they have produced anything powerful enough?
They have unlimited number of slaves. Maybe they only hum or something. I don't know. I don't know. It has to be rediscovered. I mean, or maybe a combination between water and vibration.
I think you just made that up.
It's like sonar. Like you can do things like that.
You could do. Yes, I'm aware, but I don't think you can do things.
Just make that. I mean, somebody
3000 BC.
That's not an original idea for me. Anyway,
right.
So let's talk about that wonderful period of Catholic history, the Crusades. I don't know if I mean that or not. I think I meant to be sarcastic, but there was idealistic. I mean, the point of embarking on the Crusades. Well, first they talk about the Crusades in Europe, and then there's the Crusades to go to to free the Holy Lands. And in a sense, I mean, it was from a purpose. Let's give them credit, and then we can talk about how bad they were. They wanted to be able to have pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and it really just wasn't safe to do that at the time. It wasn't safe to travel, and they were in non-Christian hands, and so you want to, quote, liberate, end quote, them. But, of course, that involves a lot of killing.
Yes,
which I think Jesus would have frowned upon.
Probably.
Don't you think?
Probably.
Might have.
Yes.
Anyway, so the material, as the author begins this section, the material and spiritual recovery of the West was dramatically demonstrated when Urban II proclaimed the First Crusade, War of the Cross, in 1095. They had several purposes: retaking the Holy Land from the Muslims, making pilgrimages possible again because of safety, demonstrating the unity of Christendom, and providing European nobility with a cause worthy of their warlike spirit instead of just killing each other all the time. Which makes sense. You want to have an external enemy to fight rather than fighting each other. Yeah. And that, the chivalry and that kind of noble fighting spirit, so-called noble fighting spirit, it would make it important to redirect that to an outside enemy. Yeah. Rather than keep killing each other, in a sense. So, of course, the Crusaders took pilgrims' vows. They also created this system of indulgences, which were when
I didn't realize this is where this came from.
Promised to go on a crusade, but then thought better of it, and they're like, okay, well, I got to pay for having promised and not fulfilled. Yeah. And that's the start of the indulgences, right?
Because he says the indulgences before that were attached to pilgrimages, so it's like you would get the indulgence for actually pilgrimaging to this place, but then that became signing up for the crusade, and then that became paying for your spot in the crusade. Right. And so that's where it came from. I didn't realize that was the history there.
Yeah, and it's that kind of paying for your spot in a war happened during the Civil War, because they'd have drafts, and they'd have wealthy people could, instead of going to war, could pay other people to go in their place. So it's a common thing, like where you throughout history you hire mercenaries or others to go in your place, and so I fulfilled my obligation to society by paying him to go die or killed or whatever. So the Crusaders' cry was, quote, "God wills it," which is a very nice thing, a very pleasant thought. God wills, it. But when you're shoving your sword into someone's heart and you're screaming, "God wills it," it's probably pretty scary to be on the other end of that.
That is true.
Some things taken into different contexts can be very frightening. And I like the author kind of says it rather pleasantly at the end of this paragraph. Inevitably, talks about how they have religious passion, and they, like I mentioned at the beginning, that you're trying to give them credit that they had a pious reason for doing it. But he says, inevitably, however, there were opportunities for gratuitous brutality and greed.
That's,
well, there's an opportunity. It doesn't mean you have to take it. And the immediate prelude for this for these was they thought that they had to reclaim the Holy Land for the second coming.
Yeah.
Which makes a certain amount of sense, because you're talking about around the year 1000, and where the Gospels talk about the end of the world is near almost, and so like, well, when is that?
Yeah.
And like they say, you never know when your personal day with Jesus is coming, but it's kind of said in a way that it's going to happen for everybody at the same time soon. And now, over 2,000 years later, it still hasn't happened. So, anyway, there's a section which I always enjoy reading. The section, "The Jews," which when you're on a religious crusade to liberate the Holy Land, it's probably a dangerous time to be a Jew along that road.
Probably.
I would think. And so, so there's just a brief interlude about how. There's a belief by some that the Jews were as great of an obstacle to the Christian claim to the Holy Land as were the Muslims. So they, I'm sure that I think that's been heavily documented about how they were not nice to the Jews.
Yes, just put it lightly, I guess.
They were not polite.
No, not really.
And they were very popular at the time, as you might expect, going off to war to liberate the Holy Land. So you have something good to fight for and that. But I like how the author mentions, many non-combatants accompanied the armies. Of course, back then you had to have non-combatants. You had to have cooks and all the other support, not just the people that are actually going to fight the wars. But he says many non-combatants accompanied the army's clergy, including bishops, but also prostitutes.
Well, good and bad, I guess. I do like the story he tells on the next page. During the First Crusade, a charismatic preacher called Peter the Hermit, who died in 1115, attracted 20,000 volunteers to Cologne, many of whom were peasants and other non-combatants, who marched to the east and what was called the People's Crusade. And then 100 years after that, the Children's Crusade lured away thousands, not all of whom were children, and many of whom never returned and were sold into slavery in North Africa. Which is
unscrupulous sea captains.
Yeah, it's just brutal.
Yeah.
But he's kind of showing just how popular the support was. You didn't even need an official, statement from the church. You could have just some guy go, "Hey, this is important. We need to go take back the Holy Land.
Right.
Give me your kids, I guess."
Yeah.
And then they would march away, and many of them never returned.
I like this mysterious figure called Master of Hungary, who rampaged through France with hordes of people called Pastoral, which is shepherds, and demanded liberation of holy places and assaulting and even killing clergy. It was put down by Louis the Ninth.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, I would think when you have enough peasants together, it'd be pretty difficult force to deal with.
It's true, especially if they're under a guy named the Master of Hungary. I don't know what he was up to.
I'm fascinated by Hungary,
and
it's modern day Hungary too, but because they're right there in the mix of it now, being a border of Ukraine and not and kind of they assert to be a Christian nation, but they don't have it codified.
Yeah.
But But anyway, so it's
Hungary's interesting in like for linguistic reasons
they have
because
their own
Hungary,
language, don't they?
Hungary and Finland or in Finnish, Hungarian and Finnish are related, but they're not Indo-European. So they're Finno-Ugric, so they're not related to like any of the other European languages. Really, they're not in the same family.
They're related to each other.
They're related to each other.
I did not know that Finnish was
and Hungarian.
not a non-Indo-European.
So there's some theories about how that's possible.
What's their what is their etymology? I mean, where do they come from? Just that area?
We're not sure. That's the thing.
Oh.
They either migrated from up north in Finland down south, or there was a big westward push. Because some people have thought that Hungarian is like similar to Mongolian in some ways.
Yeah, it could
so
be.
I think it could be the Huns possibly,
Right.
but that's really uncertain.
You should. That would be an interesting area to study.
Yeah, that would be.
But I knew they had their own language.
Yeah.
They say it's very hard to learn.
Yes, because it's
not
completely
Indo-European.
unrelated to any European language.
Yeah.
So if you speak a European language, you're going to have a hard time learning Finnish or Hungarian because you just don't have any common.
I wonder if it's hard for. I guess it must be really hard for Hungarians to learn English too. But a lot of them speak English out of necessity.
Yes.
Anyway, so there's a mention of Hungary again in the next little section because it talks about the conversions in Europe. Finally getting all the last holdouts converted. And it's the Magyars, I guess, Magyars.
Magyars.
Huh?
Magyars.
Magyars?
Magyars.
Magyars?
Yes, that's what I say.
Okay, then that must be what it is. Of Hungary were converted in the early 11th century through their king, St. Stephen, who is, I think, the patron saint of Hungary.
I believe so.
Yeah, there's then they have an annual celebration of St. Stephen. He married the sister of the sainted Henry II of Germany. And then the Poles conquered the Wends in northeastern Europe in 1121 and began to re-Christianize them. Because I think those were the people, if we discussed last section, where they converted and then they unconverted, and then the Poles conquered them and forced them to convert again, which is the best way to find Jesus, at the point of a sword.
Naturally.
But anyway, so then there's a mention that progress was precarious. A Lithuanian king changed. He said the word I've never seen before.
Apostatize.
Apostatize. So it means I guess you you
declare yourself not Christian anymore. I suppose.
And you destroyed a cathedral, built a pagan temple. I don't know why you couldn't just put a new sign on it or something. It just says pull off they pull off the cross and put pagan temple on top or something. But he was devoted to not being devoted, I guess. So there's some discussions of that in Finland and Lithuania.
Yeah. Well, the Lapps of the far north remain pagan, the last European people to do so.
Right.
And so they're far north of Finland, and they're related. They speak a similar language to Finnish, so that they're part of that language family. It's like them, some scattered tribes up in the north of Finland and northwest Russia up there, and then the Hungarians, and that's the only people who speak this family of languages.
That's isn't that weird how? Of course, that's what you study. It's how language goes from peoples to peoples and interesting history of a people and of their language and as you would argue, it affects their very culture and how they think about the world because the format of every thought.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you can kind of trace the history of a people by looking at their language.
Yeah.
Like if you look at English, pre-1066, there's no, French words. There's no Latin roots in any English. It's very Germanic. But after that, of course, in 1066, the French conquered much of England and changed the popular language or the language that people wanted to speak into French because that was the ruling language. It's we have to speak, the king. We have to speak the ruling people.
I've read somewhere that English is the most adaptive language. Is that fair to say?
I would say so. I mean,
it's certainly influenced by so many other forces.
Yeah. I mean, it's very easy to just add new words in English, and any language can generally do that. But
interesting.
Yes.
Well, there's so many exceptions to every rule in English. Maybe that's we're just used to it not making any sense.
Yeah,
that word means something else. Okay. Or actually, I'm not okay with that. But that word means this new thing or something.
Yes.
Or we can use that other word for the same thing. I don't know.
Yes.
Anyway, so the Reconquista, which is really talking about the Muslims in Western Europe getting pushed out of Spain. They were expelled from Sicily by the Normans. which I always think Norman is English.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, what are the Normans doing down in Sicily? But of course, they conquered all the way through, like, the Mediterranean, that kind of stuff. And slowly they were pushed back by the Spanish, which was, they had a division of the Catholic forces, and they finally kind of reunited or acted in concert to get the what they called the Moors at the time, the Muslim forces out of that area for the most part during this period of time. And in 1035, Catholic Spain was divided into the kingdoms Navarre, Castile, and Aragon. I wonder if that's where you got the name for Aragorn.
No.
Aragorn? No.
I would say no.
All right. Very well.
Yep.
I had to we haven't made a Tolkien reference in a long time.
We haven't.
Did he know Hungarian? Do we know?
I think he did, actually. I think he did study in Hungarian.
I would think he would be fascinated by it.
I think he studied Finnish, too, because I know he was really into, like, Finnish literature.
Yeah.
So he wrote, like, a bunch of stories sort of based...
Is there great Finnish literature?
Mm-hmm. The Kalevala.
Oh, is that Finnish?
Yes. Yeah, that's.
Well, why do you look at me like I'm retarded? I mean,
no,
I'm not supposed to say that word.
I did not look at you. I looked at you because I was surprised that you even knew what the Kalevala was.
Yeah, isn't that the origin story and the myths, gods, and stuff?
Yeah, it's the big.
Isn't it one of the oldest books ever written?
No, not really, because it was really only compiled in the 1800s. But it's like this guy went around Finland and collected a bunch of the oral stories that were told. And so that was in Finland.
The Kalevala.
Kalevala, yes.
You've mentioned it several times. That's why
I guess I have.
Which is a weird experience for a guy because you have these kids that they don't know anything, and you're teaching them like where to poop, early on. Like, you can't poop there. you can't pee there. Stop that. Don't run with scissors. And then eventually they start teaching you stuff, which is really off-putting.
Interesting. That's great.
It's not off-putting. It's something that every parent gets to benefit from if they're open to learning from their own children. Anyway, so let's see. I don't know if we want to talk anymore about the Reconquista. I mean, it's a tortured history, going back and forth, and of course, when the Catholics were split in their forces or they started to fight each other, then the Muslims were able to take more land, and then ultimately Ferdinand the Third, I think, really finally got them removed from that land. Yeah.
Finally took Cordoba, and then forced the Muslims to reestablish their caliphate yet further south in Granada. Granada.
Tomato. So then there's a next section is devotional life, which is how were they devoted to church? What do they do? And that I always mispronounce this asceticism.
Yeah,
I got it.
Yes, you did.
The disciplining oneself to submit to God's will was a big deal. Fasting and then taking dangerous pilgrimages, and scourging, which I always found really weird. And I was never a fan of scourging, especially if anybody knew you were being scourged. Like if you're. I think it's performative, but
do you know a lot of people who scourge themselves these days? Do you have a particular grudge?
No, it's not a particular. It's more of a general theory.
I see.
Because you've had people over in history that I'm scourging myself. I'm wearing sackcloth.
Too many performative scourgers.
I have not met any of them. My circle of friends is pretty small. I know no scourgers. Scourgies, which would also be scourgies, I guess.
I suppose.
They also adapted during this time prayer books. So not the Bible, but a book of prayers and different devotionals and stuff, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, that was cool.
For those that could read, and of course it was always in Latin, which was the primary written language during this era.
We have
for
a copy
the church.
of one of those, like a Latin prayer book from medieval times at the library up at school.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, you should steal it.
I don't think I'll be doing
wait,
that.
what? That's interesting. Is it in Latin?
Yeah, it's in Latin.
So how old is it? Is it just like a reprint
from 1400s? No, it's like an actual original document.
No kidding.
Yeah,
is it
it's in like our special collections.
Yeah.
One of the classics majors did like their capstone on it on transcribing and translating it because nobody had like officially done that yet. That was a few years ago. Yeah.
Did that person do a good job?
As far as I can tell.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, have you read them?
Yeah. I read the paper.
That would be embarrassing if you get it all wrong.
Yeah.
You have it next to it in the museum, and nobody would know.
Yeah,
except for those few that would know.
Yeah, the first person to actually read this thing in like 200 years and just gets it wrong.
Yeah. Well, they bet, but like the museum curators probably wouldn't know.
Oh yeah, probably.
Oh, you translated here. Let's put this next to it.
Yeah.
And then like somebody the very rare person that would know how to read Latin would be like, "This is all wrong, you fools." You almost want to do it like gibberish. Like you would just completely make up stuff. That would be a good prank. That'd be a slow punchline.
Yes.
So they wouldn't even know the joke until years later. Then you laugh at them. Ha 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 ha! I did that on purpose. I wasn't just incompetent. So there's a lot of preaching was kind of a new thing outside of Mass during this period of time. In large churches, the author says, in large churches there was no longer the homily was delivered from the sanctuary, holy place, but from pulpits, which platforms erected halfway along the nave to enable everybody to hear, which I guess makes, like when you go to those older cathedrals, they always have they do the readings up from, is it a pulpit, I guess? Is that what you call it?
No, that's a lectern.
A lectern. Like
yes.
There's way, like you go up almost like a spiral staircase up to some of them, which are pretty cool. But now we have, speakers.
Yeah, that's true.
So pilgrimages during this time remain the highest aspiration of popular devotion. Of course, it was very hard to travel to the Holy Land for various reasons. It was hard to travel, I'm sure, to anywhere. And so like those, they would go to different places like Rome or St. James, the shrine of St. James at the Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where they had those, what do they call those?
Relics.
Relics, thank you. And then there's also kind of a new appreciation or push for the devotion of the human Jesus, his humanity, which was begun by Saint Bernard, not the dog, and he's a very prominent figure in the church history, and mentioned throughout this section. And so, as the author says, whereas in earlier centuries, the Passion of the Christ was overshadowed by his resurrection, devotion to his passion, and including intense personal sorrow, now became a hallmark of piety. So I guess that's what their focus was as far as their praying and their all that stuff.
Different from, he says, the previous idea and sort of the more Eastern idea of sort of the really separation of God from us, sort of the distance between us and him, sort of the more explicit reverence, I suppose. I mean, there's still reverent, forms of looking at it, but, the sort of distance, I think, is different between the two forms. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, you really see like a change or a separation in the philosophies. I think during this time, the East and West starts to really to be apparent in their view of how to worship and all that stuff. So there's a whole bunch of number of different little sections about different things that were going on as far as worship, and there's a mention of the stigmata and the creche, starting really the stigmata being I guess was Francis of Assisi the first one that was thought to have the stigmata. I don't know about those.
Which, for reference, the stigmata is the wounds of Jesus on your hands.
Right. Yeah. Do you really think that happened? You think he picked at something? I don't know. I'm a cynic when it comes to that, because I mean, really, is God going to do that? I don't know. Who am I to question, I guess. And then, but Francis also introduced the creche, the nativity scene, so we can credit him for that.
Oh, there you go.
Because I like the nativity scene.
Nativity scenes are cool.
I like to wait until Christmas morning before putting out the little baby Jesus, because that's nice. It's not there yet.
That's true.
And then novenas, which are prayers or devotions spread out over 9 days, and I guess you'd say a mass and a novena or whatever. So those are kind of a little bit different. And that corresponds to the 9 days Jesus' apostles and disciples spent in the upper room after his ascension. It's a long time.
It is a long time.
I always forget about that.
Yeah. They were scared.
Yeah. Do you think they would be too?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It'd be a freak out session, one after the other. Yeah. Here's a guy you think is like the Messiah, or is a Messiah, and then they are able to kill him without really any pushback.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't do anything to stop him.
It's not just that they killed him, but then they also started hunting down all the people who followed him.
True.
So that's pretty intense.
Yeah. And then they went out, and man, it spread like wildfire.
No kidding.
And so and also during this time is a real spread of devotion to Mary. Mary interceding with belief that she can intercede on your behalf. And the rule of Cluny, very influential, required that every monastery have a lady chapel, and that it dedicates Saturday to Mary. So you see all these different chapels, and I guess this is a period of time where they created the Rosary and the Rosary prayers. The Dominicans.
I believe so. I mean, he says, the Hail Mary. I don't know if it was created at this time, but he says by 1100, the recitation of the Ave Maria, based on the angel's greeting, "Hail, full of grace," had become popular. Yeah, and then there you see the Rosary was first promoted by the early Dominicans, although not invented by them.
Yeah, so that's a good deal.
Yes, Rosary's good. We like the Rosary.
So a lot of Mary stuff. Sorrowful Mother. What do we want to talk about that? Talking about Mary's sorrows, the 7 sorrows, the prophecy of Simeon, the flight into Egypt, which I always forget about too. The temporary loss of the boy Jesus at the temple. Oh my God, where'd our kid go? Which every parent understands in their soul. It's like that's how I started with my designating the 4 boys by 1, 2, 3, and 4, because I just do it mentally. We're at a crowd. It's hard to keep track of 4 kids. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4. I just want to make a mental note. Okay, I got all 4 of them in the crowd. Not in order of importance, just birth order. Anyway, carrying him carrying his cross, his crucifixion, taking down his body, and then his burial. It's just it's just horrible.
Yes.
Then there's the discussion of the Assumption, which wasn't official church dogma until 1950. I did not know that it was just a modern concept. It was wasn't it didn't an author say it was universally believed in the East and was widely accepted in the West, but although it was not an official dogma until 1950.
Yeah. Which is interesting.
Is that in the Bible that she is there? Is that specifically referenced that her assumption into heaven?
I'll have to think about that. I'm not sure.
I don't know that.
But it does say the reason that it did become popular is most theologians thought it inappropriate that the body had given flesh to Christ should have been allowed to decay in the grave. Which makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it does make sense to a certain degree, but then it's like, how do you explain? And of course, then she's the virgin birth, and she was without sin. Well,
and that's what we're talking about next, the Immaculate Conception.
But then you go back into how did her parents create a kid without sin? It's like, well, maybe they should have been. Who is that? Is that Joachim and?
Joachim
and
Anne.
Yeah.
Yes, I thought you were saying and.
No,
I thought you were trying to come up with the next name. And.
Were her parents, right?
Yes, Joachim and
Anne. Anyway. So, so then, just talked about Immaculate Conception and St. Anselm's discussion of that. St. Bernard and Thomas Aquinas, they did not accept the Immaculate Conception theory. Then moving along to Loreto.
Yeah, this is weird. This is interesting.
This was a belief that the house where Jesus grew up in Nazareth had been miraculously transported to Loreto in Italy. I guess they were the Mormons of their time. Because they believe somebody was miraculously transported to the United States before it was the United States.
I think Independence, Missouri was like either where Jesus' second coming is going to happen, or it was the original Garden of Eden. I'm trying to remember which one.
Was it Missouri or was it Illinois? Because they were in Illinois
Missouri,
for a while before
Independence, Missouri. Yeah, is what they believe. And then we kicked them all out.
I had never heard that theory. I guess we should go to Loreto in Italy.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
There's going to be a crush there. But no, that would be in Bethlehem because he grew up in Nazareth.
Yes, that's true. That is true.
So it'll be a little bit of carpenter's tools, I guess, for his pop.
There you go.
And then there's a discussion of the prayers of the dead, so that, and I think it was the All Souls Day was first celebrated during this period of time, but we're talking about, the 1200s. And now we have Halloween, and nobody even knows why you're doing Halloween.
That is true.
The next day is All Saints Day?
All Saints Day.
Because Halloween is
All Souls Day.
All Souls Day, then it's All Saints Day.
All Saints Day, yes.
Saintly royalty is the next section, which, of course, more of the royalty were proclaimed to be saints.
He has a huge list of them throughout this time period. We're not going to read all of them. But yeah, it's interesting that so many just like political leaders were seen as, the most eligible to be saints.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we think that at all anymore.
Oh, I don't know. There were probably some people that would want to beatify Trump and people who would beatify Biden, or whoever.
That is fair.
We all have the same, those kind of things are. And Mother Teresa. I don't know. She's not an example. I won't go down that path.
Yeah, no.
We have limited time. You got to get back to. We're live and in person.
We are. Well, we're not live, but we are in person recording this.
We are live. We have this discussion every time. We're recording this live and in person.
Well, okay, sure.
We are recording it.
Well, usually when you say you're recording something live, you're recording it when they're performing in front of a live audience. Right? Because you don't say this is like, the Little Feat album. You don't say, this is... give me one of their songs. Why can't I think of it?
Fat Man in the Bathtub.
Fat Man in the Bathtub. You don't say this is the live recording of Fat Man in the Bathtub when it's the studio recording. Because it was recorded live because they were in person and it was happening to them. But you say this is the live version when it was them and they were performing to a live audience.
I'm going to give our listener a personal tidbit about me. I love to listen to that song when I'm in the bathtub.
That's great, Dad. That's really great.
Almost every time. Every time I remember it. So anyway, moving on to relics, which we already discussed.
Yes.
I didn't know they were bought and sold so much, which that commerce constituted simony, which is a word that I have heard and seen in this book many times and have not seen it almost any time before or since. The discussion of marriage is really fascinating to me. That it was that during this period of time, am I skipping forward too much?
No.
Okay. That it really was not originally part of the church. The church really wasn't involved originally, which was a surprise to me. I was thinking it was always kind of a deal, but during this period of time, the church took increasing responsibility for matrimony, according to the author. Defining the degrees of blood relationship which a valid marriage could occur, and requiring free consent of the spouses, which is nice.
That's a good thing.
And then allowing annulments if they're not consummated, and requiring a liturgical ceremony. But it could be valid even if they just made a commitment to each other. Mm-hmm. And divorce didn't exist at the time, but there were a whole bunch of appeals for separations. Mm-hmm. Like the other person cheated on me or whatever, or lack of consent and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you see the church is getting more and more involved in that. Mm-hmm. And I like this little section here, or this very bottom of, 166? Mm-hmm. Theologians took an increasingly positive view of marriage as not merely a remedy for concupiscence. There you go. As Paul implied in one place, but as a divinely ordained sacrament modeled on the relationship between Christ and his church, as Paul said in another. Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting.
I tend to agree with it being a sacrament. It's a big deal, and I think it's foundational, not only of the church, but of society at large. But other people disagree, I guess.
True.
And we've so denigrated marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not even... I think I can go on and on about that.
Yeah, no kidding.
That's why I think people are okay with gay marriage and all that stuff, because why not?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't mean anything anyway. Mm-hmm. Might as well just let everybody do what they want. The next step is bigamy. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that is going to be incest. And after that will be animals.
That's fantastic.
Can you see it coming?
Yeah. That is true.
It's down the pike. Although the transgender thing, I think, has been an overstep by the left, and I think that's screwing up their progress.
Interesting.
On all fronts.
Yeah.
Mainly because it's a fracturing of their own group.
Yeah.
Because the transgenders are just kicking the tail out of the feminists.
Yeah.
I mean, it is really, really funny. Anyway, but on to procreation, which is an important issue, especially with the Catholic Church, that marriage, the purpose of marriage is procreation, according to Catholic theology, which which I think it should be the main focus and purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it is not the only purpose, because what happens if you're sterile or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
You have to deal with those kind of things too. So there's a discussion of that. Aquinas considering sexual pleasure to be an inducement to the act of procreation and not necessarily sinful. I guess I guess if you enjoy it, it's supposed to be a sin or something. I don't know. And I like how that they used the term back then, marital debt, which meant, hey, you're married to me, you gotta have sex with me. But of course, there were moralists that hesitated over approving long absence from home of men who went on the Crusades, because they understood what happens if men are off to war. Sometimes they make mistakes and intentional and all that kind of stuff. So let's see, lay vocation. So what is that? What was that? I'm trying to remember.
So when he was saying that at some points, married couples were allowed to separate in order to enter religious life.
Oh yeah,
because they saw that the spiritual world being more important than the physical world, and so marriage is sort of the physical call. Yeah, and then, but if you want to pursue the spiritual call, you can separate in your marriage, which is interesting.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah,
it's you can't be married and living separately in a monastery and a convent.
Yeah,
that's not a marriage.
Yeah,
that is a separation.
Yes,
or divorce or whatever. So there's the monarchies, of course, had a big problem with not being able to have divorce, because they treated marriage as a way to cement alliances.
Yeah,
and that's how Philip I of France was excommunicated, because he divorced his wife and married his cousin. He committed a double sin, according to the author. And there's examples throughout history of these, and the arranged marriages were very common with the aristocracy, because you were cementing relationships and contracts, and for the most part, women were treated as like a property or some sort of something of value to exchange. And then there's which necessarily brings up the discussion of courtly love. Mm-hmm. So you have these arranged marriages, and you can understand in those circumstances a lot more about why people cheated or had affairs, because you're just married by convenience or by this arrangement, and there's no love there, but the hope is that you grow to love each other, I guess. We don't have that same excuse now.
No, we don't.
Because nobody's forcing you to get married. There are no modern day currently shotgun marriages, and but it's a weird world now. I mean, I was shocked by the statistic that women initiate divorces by a rather strong preponderance. You always think the men are doing it. Now we're talking about the legal proceedings, so maybe men have left, but you always think of dirty men, cheating on their spouses and leaving their innocent spouse, behind or whatever, which does occur, but. Actually initiating the divorce process is mostly done by women in their more recent years. So it's a troubling situation for our youth coming out now. Because you look statistically, marriages, when you marry young, you're more likely to have a longer marriage than if you wait until you're in your 30s.
Interesting.
Well, I think one of the key points is the more partners you have before marriage, the less likely your marriage is going to succeed. Period. I mean, that's one of those statistics that's just rock solid. It can still work, but there's all sorts of trust issues and satisfaction issues and all that kind of stuff that raise their ugly head, I guess you say. Anyway, so where were we at?
His discussion of courtly love, I think, was interesting. Because he says, that sort of started with the popularity of the romances and stuff like that. And he says, courtly love usually celebrated an attraction between a man and a woman who were not married to each other. So that wasn't good. And of course, these sort of stories were told by troubadours who were traveling singers. They went around and told all these stories, usually about, I think King Arthur and Guinevere and stuff like that. But then he says, as it spread north, courtly love was modified in accord with attempts to Christianize the warrior spirit through the code of chivalry, which the lady was idealized and unattainable, while the knight served her unselfishly. So sort of making it more of a Christian concept. And then that's where we get the titles of Our Lord and Our Lady, which came to be, Jesus and Mary.
Yeah,
interesting. I didn't realize that. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting literary history note. Talking about literary, what of the liturgy?
Yes,
How do you like that for a
good.
segue?
We can kind of skim through this one a little bit, not
Really?
go into too much detail.
Oh,
Well, we're already 40 minutes in. I don't know if you realize we still have.
No, we only have like 5 pages left.
We have like 17.
All right. Yes, we can. So, but I thought this was more interesting than the last section.
Oh.
So because you could see where these things were, the things were added to the liturgy.
Yeah,
the
sure.
the Confiteor, the I confess, and the Gloria, kneeling until communion. During that period of time, the ringing of the bell was made part of the tradition, the Mass. The elevation of the Eucharist and the wine. The church bells ringing at the consecration to signal to the outside of the church, the miracle just occurred. The Lord, I'm not worthy was started this time. The last blessing, I guess that would be the blessing at the end, like go in peace or go and serve the Lord or whatever.
Yes.
So that the liturgical colors during the 13th century really came to be accepted. White for feasts of Christ and for virgins and confessors, red for martyrs, purple for penitential seasons of Lent and Advent, green for long periods after the Pentecost, black for the dead. Mm-hmm. And so what, places for, music, damn it. Although we were just at Mass at a different church this weekend to pick up Eli from a sleepover. Mm-hmm. And they had less singing.
They did have
Did
less
you
singing.
notice that?
I did notice that.
I was really pleased by that. It made up for the somewhat unfocused and lengthy homily. The homily was okay.
Yes.
But he had like 5 homilies.
Yes.
That he went from one to the other with really not a whole lot of segue.
He sure did. Yes.
But interesting cat.
Yes.
Don't know that priest, but music was integral to the divine worship in larger churches during this period of the Middle Ages, which the belief that the soul could rise above mundane things and enter into the heavenly reign. But I did like that Saint Bernard, who was suspicious of aesthetic pleasure, warned against music that obscured the scriptural texts it was meant to support. So I do agree with Saint Bernard in that respect.
I would agree.
Chanting was a big thing there. The Cluny people pioneered the practice of the monks chanting in these choir stalls, and elaborate polyphonic masses were composed. That's pretty cool stuff.
Yeah,
I mean, that kind of stuff I can get into, but I don't want it every day.
Yeah, that's fair.
Those are like special events, I think. Moving forward, Eucharistic piety, or do you, let's see.
Yeah, well, the sacred drama, I want to touch on that.
Oh, all right.
Yeah,
so you want me to run through them and then you stop me?
Well, you skipped over this one. But it grew directly out of the liturgy, originally with clerics and vestments enacting scenes from the Gospels in the body of the church.
Oh, yeah.
It's just a very foreign concept to us. Like, I can't imagine, a priest getting up and putting on like a Jesus costume and acting out like the crucifixion in a church. Right. And that came to be just very popular plays outside of the church. It's just a strange thing you don't think about.
Yeah, I wonder if they do that in those non-denominational weird churches.
They might.
I'm just joking for any non-denominational people that are weird that are listening. Or people that are not weird who are non-denominational. Anyway, festivals, joyous festivals were really kind of, I think, created or really became big. Yeah.
Especially Mardi Gras.
Fat Tuesday, where you got to eat everything because, and I think it probably originated, if I remember correctly, because people would eat their food stores because they're going to fast. They're going to go bad anyway. It's
been like all the meat and stuff, so you can't wait, 40 days of Lent with your meat just sitting there. So it's all going to spoil.
And of course, it became an excuse for riotous behavior, as the author says.
It's unfortunate.
Which is why all those non-Catholics are celebrating Mardi Gras. Like, wait a second. You haven't been to church in 10 years. I don't care. I'm going to Mardi Gras. Really, you got a fast tomorrow? What? What's a fast? I run fast. Do other things fast, too. How do you like that?
That's great. That's a good
7 sacraments. Is this one that was kind of formalized? Mm-hmm. Is that what the author's saying? That the 7 sacraments were really accepted as those being the 7 sacraments? Mm-hmm. And then talking about in the 11th century, the people might confess their sins openly at Mass and receive absolution. But for mortal sins, private confession was still required. and absolution was not necessarily ordinarily granted at the time of confession, but only after the penitent had completed a very demanding penance. I guess you had to go like on a quest or something.
Yeah, maybe.
So, and then they had penitentials spread, which are these a guidebook that delineated the various sins and indicated how they were to be treated. So I guess they had a little, okay, you committed murder on this charge, and then they go over, wait, you got to do all these things. You got to say 7 Hail Marys, and then you're okay. But if you commit attempted murder, it's only 6 Hail Marys. Mm-hmm. Last things, hour of death. I've heard about, like what's in our liturgy, the hour of death. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that was like a big thing, that they really thought angels and demons were fighting over your soul at that last hour of your death. Do you think that occurs? Do you think that's interesting? Maybe. I never even considered that possibility that, they're going to know, I guess. Yeah. You're going to be hit by a car in 59 minutes. So all these angels, and there's the hour after. No, it's the hour before, I would think. Yeah. Because you have that opportunity to repent all your evil sins and such.
Yes. That is true.
Anyway, so that was a big thing back then.
Yes.
Funerals were as elaborate as a family could afford, which I think is partly true today too.
Yeah, that's true.
But there was there talk about different things that people would do, like the dismemberment of Aquinas' body was not a unique circumstance where they would like take part of it, like these relics.
Yeah, they'd include it like in their will, and they'd be like, cut me up and put some of me here at this important place or at this important place, which is kind of wild.
It is. Prayers for the dead, which is basically you're praying for them after they've died because they may be in purgatory, I guess, or they may intercede with somebody else. Mm-hmm. The last will and testament, which was originally a religious document, and the jurisdiction of the church courts had over it because it was a witness or testament to their last wishes of the deceased and hopefully the state of his soul. So hopefully it would be a good thing. We had a client that was sitting in on an older attorney's estate planning session when I was first doing private practice, and he had a falling out with his daughter. So he wanted to leave everything to the other kids, and he wanted to have a check issued to her in the amount of $6.66.
Wow. That's pretty intense.
That is a mistake.
Yeah.
To have that as your last act.
Yeah. Well, especially,
have I told you that story before? You don't seem shocked.
I've never heard that.
I was shocked by that.
That's insane.
I mean, I heard this guy say that.
Yeah.
I thought he was joking. No, I'm serious. I wanted to check issued.
That's wild.
Because she's that bad. Yeah. I hate her. Like, wow. That's your daughter, dude.
Well, he goes on to say, that the reason that, even leaving money in your will became a thing, so it was seen as like doing penance and proof of your faith, because you would leave it for,
charitable
the church or charitable purposes.
Yep. Yeah. Yes, true.
And then it became some guy wanting to issue checks worth $6.66. Yeah. So very different approach there.
Well, it's the same approach. Well, it's the same theory.
Yes.
I want to send a message from the grave.
Different messages, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I could just see, him getting to the pearly gates and Jesus saying, you're a pretty good guy, but, you really screwed up with your last will and testament.
Yeah, no kidding.
Because, I don't think he was a thoughtful religious man. Anyway, sacred architecture. This was really cool.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much we want to talk about it. I mean, just that the building, the church building declined in the Dark Ages. And the author makes a great point that this was really the architecture of these churches was, the building of these huge churches was the most telling sign of the recovery of civilization and a recovery of religious belief and really the strength of society. And I think that is also true in modern times.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Because if you look at what people are building, especially these massive, constructions, and also in their art, I think like that is telling of what a society like values and where they're at. Like,
and who's building churches now? Not Catholics.
Yeah, no kidding.
Well, a very rare Catholics. I mean, it's usually like for a migration from one area of a region to another, or where like 10 old stone churches in a city are now vacant or being sold or used for other purposes, but they're building one or two larger modern churches out in the suburbs, because people have moved. But really, the churches that are being built now are like big glass monstrosities for the other denominations or non-denominationals.
Yeah.
Those are
Generally
really
the
growth.
non-denominationals that I've seen. Yeah.
Like Grace churches. I mean, I'm not trying to disparage any particular. I don't know anything about. There's a place called Grace Church here in this area. They do good things, but I don't know anything about their beliefs.
Yeah.
But they're, as I understand it, they're non-denominational. That's really the growth.
Mm-hmm.
But I do like how the author says the building these churches, these great churches intended to last for centuries, was an act of faith not only in God but in the future of the city as well. And I think that is true. It sends a message about what you believe in, that you believe that this city, this town, this community is going to last well past your death, and so you're investing in that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that we need to talk about specific, Byzantine, Romanesque, Gothic, Neo-Roman or whatever. I mean, of course, that Neo-Roman was not during this period of time, but they had, they built it to pay homage to God, and especially when you're getting to, the windows, stained glass windows, and they have messages, they have carvings that tell the story of
That's what he kind of says in the
Jesus and all that.
next section over here, the church's book. Like if you just look around the church, you can just get the story of your faith by looking at the stained glass, the paintings on the walls and stuff like that, which I think is a really neat concept that sort of evolved here.
Yep. And and that would help the illiterate, so you can see the story and to see who the leaders of the church were and the past saints and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, he also talks about divine proportion, which is interesting. He says the interior of the church was intended to be itself an experience of heaven based on the metaphysics of light expounded by Pseudo-Dionysius.
Yeah.
So the understanding, like if you just lay it out according to these mathematical principles and these sort of divine ratios, A, it looks nice, and B, it's it sort of plays into that idea that there's significance in these numbers that we're using.
I didn't know that baptismal fonts. I think I've noticed they're octagonal, both because Christ was the 8th day of creation, because he's the afterlife, I guess. Mankind was allotted 7 ages from birth to death, and 8 therefore symbolize new life. I never knew that.
That's interesting.
Now for the big section for this area is the intellectual renaissance. The monastic and cathedral schools. St. Anselm was, of course, at the forefront of this. I don't know. Have we talked about that in this podcast? Because we talked about it in the philosophical history.
We definitely did.
I always get them melded together, but he was a preeminent thinker of this time. There's a renaissance of the 12th century. It's been called the greatest of all such revivals that marked the greatest progress within the shortest period of time. John of Salisbury, which is the school of Chartres. He was a Platonist. Yeah.
Platonist, yeah.
Loved classical literature. He warned. He warned that the emphasis on logic would bring about the decline in the study of liberal arts by making them seem insufficiently rigorous. And there's an urge for order. So the science of logic and dialectic was very strong during this period of time. That's when scholasticism was brought to the forefront, where you're trying to use logic and ordered systems.
It's very abstract, technical, systematic. Sort of just trying to reason through all of these big problems, not necessarily just relying on, well, this is what one person said and at one point in time, but really sort of using these more logical scholastic principles.
And so you during using that philosophy and that theory and that school of thought, you have the codification of canon laws, has systematized it. You have the necessity of free consent to marriage under the same kind of legal theories and divine theories, outlawing the ordeal of favor of the judgment of in favor of the judgment of juries. So you don't have ordeal where you're testing them by trying to make them sink in a pond or whatever. And then having a more formal process for canonizing saints according to some sort of objective criteria, rather than just everybody likes that person, who we think of when we think of that in modern times, Mother Teresa. The scholastics sought to deepen and clarify doctrines by defining them more precisely, as the author says. So there was a monk, Berenger of Tours, died in 1088, which he addressed the transubstantiation terminology. He was condemned for holding that since the appearance didn't change, It didn't happen, basically.
Yeah. The
He
substances remain the
recanted. He recanted his recantation, and then recanted again. It was a difficult. It was a dangerous time to be a heretic.
same. Yeah, no kidding.
Because they would just kill you or do whatever they're going to do. So, and so then Lateran, the Council of Lateran, isn't it the Council of Lateran the Fourth, or is that Lateran the Fourth a person? That's a council, isn't it?
I think
Lateran
so.
the Fourth defined the doctrine of transubstantiation, which was later developed by Thomas Aquinas, teaching that Eucharist is unique in being miraculously the sole case, which is the unseen substance changes, but the visible accidents remain the same.
Mm-hmm.
It became the accepted Western way of understanding the real
Yeah.
presence.
It still has the appearance of bread and wine, but is truly the body, blood, soul, and
Yes.
divinity. Yes.
So it was this whole idea. The scholastic movement was essentially began with Saint Anselm, was faith-seeking understanding. So you're studying it using reason because God gave us reason, and so we should use that as much as possible to understand the beliefs
Yeah.
rather than just blind faith, which
It
I
says,
agree with.
The truths of faith can be neither proved nor disproved by human reason, but men are obliged to use reason to understand them as far as possible.
Yep.
So it's not, we're trying to come up with new, ideas here necessarily. We're just trying to understand the existing ideas, more or less.
Yep. So then there's the discussion of different, let's see here, discussion of the difference between the essence and existence to understand God, because there's, what is the essence of that thing rather than whether it exists.
Mm-hmm.
What else do we want to talk about here?
Well, his point there is that in God, existence and essence are the same, and that his essence is simply to exist.
Yes.
So the idea that God is, just being, essentially.
So we want to talk about the
Soteriology.
Soteriology.
Yes, which is the doctrine of salvation. How did
Yes.
Jesus actually save us in his death? But he says, Anselm, based on Paul and Augustine, proposed that mankind owed God an infinite, unpayable debt that only a man who is also divine could repay, which the second person of the Trinity, freely and with infinite love, took upon himself, suffering and dying to ransom mankind, which I believe is still sort of the church understanding of soteriology.
So then there's critics of scholasticism, the limits of reason. Stephen Langton, while a professor in Paris, was the first to divide the Bible into chapters and verses.
Because, as he mentions, theology was primarily the study and exposition of Scripture.
Yes.
And he says, Peter Damian opposed the growing dominance of logic on the grounds that it placed limits on God. We should be
there's some truth to that.
I think there is, yeah.
But I like this thing, which he said, God's not bound by logic even, because he can make two contradictory things both true.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I don't know if I believe that. I guess he could.
Yeah.
But why would he?
Well, I think it's like Jesus.
Contradictory to us, I guess.
Yeah, well, the church teaching on Jesus is he has two natures at once.
Yes.
He's both fully God and fully human.
Yeah.
So I think that's like two contradictory things. You cannot technically be fully God, fully one thing, and fully another thing.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
You can have a red circle, and it's fully red and fully a circle.
Well, yes.
They're not. They're overlapping. Anywho,
Interesting. Okay.
I've just disproved your criticism
maybe
of that. Think about that for the next time.
I will.
Saint Bernard, not the dog, was the most severe critic of this reason-based philosophy, which I don't. Yeah, I mean, he may be overstating, that they were just saying it's only reason, but he was one of the last of the monastic theologians.
Mm-hmm.
His dominant concern was the salvation of souls rather than the pursuit of knowledge. So he's not saying be stupid, but he's saying you're focusing on the wrong thing. You're focusing on the formal logic and the rationality of it rather than the saving of your soul.
He's fearing that it substitutes sterile intellectualism for the living teachings of the fathers of the church. I think is a fair point to make.
Yeah, sure. As far as it goes, too.
Yes, true.
So mystical theology. Let's see. The monastery at St. Victor near Paris remained the center of more traditional kind of theology. Let's see, what do I have here? I have this with a little ha next to it. I'm just going to read it because I forget what I said. His colleague Walter of St. Victor actually cursed logicians. May your dialectic be your damnation. So more of a mystical or spiritual basis for stuff. man, I got to get moving here.
Yeah, we should.
So then the universities, I don't know that we really need to talk about all the intellectual, the universities were created during this time, I guess it's suffice to say. Basically, there's a higher level of study that needs to occur beyond what was happening in the monasteries. So you have a university, which is like a higher level, kind of like a difference between a high school and a college. And Italy became the forefront of some of this probably because of their contact with Greek and Arabic culture, and they had translated Aristotle into their language, which then could be translated into Latin, I guess, and kind of revitalized a lot of things.
True.
Talks about the creation of a professor of theology, which was the theologians became kind of a guild. So you have like a degree, kind of like we have now, and their primary constituency being the university themselves, which is pretty much how we have professors now.
Exactly.
Their primary constituency is the university. But I won't go down that path too much. The demand for rigor. Following Aristotle, scholastics demanded not merely opinion or probability, but demonstration. Logical argument that was irrefutable, which is beneficial. Really, like as you said at the beginning of all this, I think, started the scientific method, really. Reinvigorated. Aristotle started the scientific method way back in the ancient times, but this was really when it became more formalized in the university setting. As a more complete philosophy, I guess you'd say.
They adopted the method of disputation as their characteristic way of proceeding, sometimes in face-to-face debate between adversaries. This is where you kind of start to
aggressive questioning by a master in a subject or whatever.
It sort of becomes the approach that I think all science has now is, take an opinion and defend it. Have your theory, but back it up.
That's the way it's supposed to be.
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah, true.
I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see more public debates, like in a professional manner.
Yeah.
Not like we have political debates now, which is just clown shows.
Raise your hand if you like pizza.
Well, it takes time. I think I'm starting to get cautiously optimistic about the debates because you're seeing these candidates, some of the candidates, going on these more open-ended podcasts with honest and curious people that are questioning them or discussing things, and I think we can get back to really knowing what the people believe and not being, hopefully the American people cannot be distracted by all this other nonsense, the pop culture of the day. Anyway, so it started way back then, and it's the right way to do it. We're talking about, what, the year 1100, 1200, something
pretty
like that. So faith and reason was another section. As the author points out, it was reasonable to rely on faith for knowledge of supernatural mysteries, but you have a certain amount of reason to try to explain it and understand it. Let's see. I want to talk about Peter Abelard.
Sure.
He appeared as a student in Paris. He drove his professor from the lecture hall by relentless questioning. He was a brilliant logician, and he was determined to push this reason and logic as far as he could, well beyond the point many people thought valid, questioned the reality of universals on the grounds there were many differences among the various beings of particular species, so there's no common nature, et cetera, et cetera. So fascinating discussion there. Let's see, Abelard was undone by a seemingly unrelated matter, his love affair with a niece of a prominent priest whom he made pregnant. That's good. He was, ironically, it says, Abelard became a reforming abbot whose recalcitrant monks once put poison in his chalice at Mass.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
That's pretty evil.
Yeah, after he was banished to this monastery for getting this girl pregnant, then they try to kill him.
Yeah, so at communion, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. That's pretty wild.
So as I mentioned before, the rediscovery of Aristotle and that through Muslim scholars initially, and I don't think we need to go into too much detail on this because we're running out of time. But at the beginning of this discussion, like in the 1000, Avicenna, who we talked about in a different podcast, he died in 1037. These Muslim scholars were far ahead of the Christian scholars, but they kind of hit a wall, so to speak, and because of the scientific method, I think, I don't think they could really advance beyond a certain point because that scientific method would become dangerous to the Muslim faith in a way that wasn't for the Christian faith, oddly enough.
Because he says, these Muslim scholars, he says Avicenna and then Averroes, who developed Aristotle's thought, because of course they had the translations of Aristotle into Arabic. They laid out a complete system based purely on Aristotle, and he says that was at odds with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Right. So it's kind of this separate thing that didn't really work with any of them. And of course, they kind of go on to how the Quran is to be used and stuff like that. But then they kind of adapt this into Latin Averroism, which referred to Christians who continued to take Aristotle completely on his own terms and reach conclusions similar to Averroes. And sort of survived in certain universities, but then the scholastics began revising Aristotle's thought to bring it into harmony with divine revelation. Yeah. So
I think that's really the modern criticism of the Muslim faith is that you have to be able to reform it, and I think that faith doesn't really call for that. But I'm not an expert on it, so I probably shouldn't say too much. But then there's a discussion of St. Thomas Aquinas, who is one of the most prominent thinkers of most prominent Catholic philosophers. And it summed up pretty well. I mean, where he said God intended all men to be saved, assuming Aquinas assumed, therefore, truth must be knowable through reason. And I really believe that. I mean, don't you think? I mean, if God wants us to understand and God wants us to be saved, we have to understand it. We have to be able to figure it out. Yeah. So what do we want to say about...
I think his point, there's a big section here. But he says, faith and reason cannot contradict one another, but the truths of God far transcend finite reason. Yes. And so one of his most important things, I might take over here just a little bit to kind of skim through here.
Yeah, go ahead.
But one of the biggest ones was the unmoved mover. Yeah. So it's the idea of Aristotle that the universe is a chain of causes, and so he comes up with these 5 different proofs for why there has to be an unmoved mover, essentially why there has to be a first cause that started everything, which is pretty... pretty changing, I would say, this idea that we do have this logical reason for why a God has to exist. Of course, Aristotle sort of enumerated this first, but then Aquinas sort of adapted it. He then has a big section on sense knowledge, which I won't go into too much, but the idea that we have to trust our senses. That's essentially what he's getting at here. Is we can argue all we want about how there's this ethereal sort of place beyond our physical bodies, but in understanding the universe, we have to rely on our sense knowledge. We have to rely on this intellect that we have to perceive the world around us and come up with these conclusions that point to eternal truths. He then goes on to talk about the being of God. God is pure being that exists fully and without limitation. And he says central to Aquinas' thought was the analogy of being. Since God is the ultimate cause of all things, some of his perfections can be found in his creation, which reflects the perfection of God himself, but in an imperfect way. So we can see God's perfect nature through the imperfect creation around us, in a way. The primacy of the intellect, he says that his ethical theory departed from Augustine, holding that the will always desires good, and that evil is less a perversion of the will than an error in understanding. This is the choice of an apparent good over a real one, which I don't know if I agree with necessarily, but his argument's making, we do things that seem good to us, and I guess there is some truth to that, but I don't think it's what is good here, what we're talking about.
And I think it understates people's freely choosing to do bad things because it's more convenient or pleasurable or whatever.
Yes.
Agreed. So then talks about the ascendancy of St. Thomas's thinking, which of course is huge in the history of the church. I don't know if we really need to talk about all these specific things, mathematics, physics, rediscovering Euclid's geometry was a big thing, just in the scientific developments during this period of time. Of course, had a lot to do with just the development of society in the church. But I don't know if we need to talk about, let's see, Grosseteste, how do you pronounce that? He talked about the pseudo-Dionysian belief that the universe was constructed by emanation of light. I don't know if we want to talk about that.
I think Roger Bacon's a little more important. He says he invented a kind of telescope and urged that technology be used to improve the conditions of human living. Yes. And that directly plays into medieval technology. He says in Bacon's day, China was probably the most technologically advanced society in the world, but the West was in the process of surpassing it. He says the church herself made extensive use of technology, especially in building, and only condemned the occasional invention, such as the catapults or the crossbow, which were deemed too destructive. And they continue to be used anyway, even on the Crusades. So.
Yes. And there's a long discussion then at the end about the writing of Dante, which I've never read. Have you read Dante?
I need to read it. I have it on my shelf.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Divine Comedy, where he goes into the layers. It was really a commentary on hell, and it was so influential and evidently so good that the Catholic image of those places derives in great part from the Divine Comedy. You know, that the heaven and hell were only vaguely described in the Bible. So, he has this, where this kind of a story where, what is it, the Virgil?
Yeah, the Roman poet Virgil leads Dante.
Leads him into into hell, right?
Yeah.
And his main theory is that that people have really damned themselves by the choices they made. Yeah. And so that they're punished in, I guess, similar ways in hell.
Which is really sort of a Greco-Roman concept.
Yeah,
you have like Tantalus, where he's always caught between he can never reach the fruit above him, can never drink the water below him. Sisyphus constantly pushing the bowler up the hill and it rolling back down, which is directly related to how they.
Isn't Narcissus the guy stared himself in the pool of water, and so he's condemned just to always be staring at the pool? And,
I don't think that was in hell. I think that's just a prophecy.
Yeah, that's true. That's what happens in his real life. Yes. Yeah, true. Sorry.
But the hierarchy of sins, I think, is really important because that's really what he was really getting at in the Divine Comedy. As you go layer by layer, there's certain sins that are much graver than others. And he says, as a Thomist, he based this on human reason. Thus, the worst sins were lying, deceit, and treachery, which is the use of the intellect to subvert the truth rather than to disclose it. And of course, he also goes to purgatory and heaven. He says, the sufferings of purgatory were not so much punitive as therapeutic, purifying the soul and making it worthy of paradise, which is definitely a concept that survives in modern Catholicism. And then heaven, he has an interesting point here that Virgil can't go with him to heaven. Even though Virgil was this great guy, he was a great pagan. He's still a pagan, so he can't show him anymore. So it becomes Beatrice, which is I think a lover of Dante's that died and is now in heaven, who then becomes his guide. And it's just. The experience of paradise was overwhelmingly that of a light so bright that it obscured much of what Dante encountered, of which he was not as yet worthy. So, even Dante, can't really describe heaven himself because, within this story, it's so bright he cannot comprehend it. He's not even worthy to see it yet.
Yep, and the author ends this whole section with Dante revealed the ordered unity of the cosmos itself in his writings, the linkage between heaven and earth, but his great poetic synthesis was created at the very point when Christendom was on the verge of unraveling. Dun, 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 dun.
The next section is on East and West, so probably the big schism is what we're going to get to next time. What did you think of this chapter?
I really enjoyed it. I mean, this era is just fascinating to me. I'm reading more and more about it. There's so much going on,
True. Very
what
true.
Do you think? What are your thoughts?
I really liked it. I mean, all the intellectual stuff there is very interesting. Cause it's so different than any of the other people that we've read about so far.
Yes.
Because now we have these entire systems of thought that are developing that are just entirely unique. Well, I guess largely dependent on Aristotle in some ways, but it's so different from what we've seen in earlier church reasoning.
Yes.
It's very, very good.
Good
very
stuff.
Well written. Very nicely laid out.
Yes.
Do you have any final thoughts?
No.
All right. Well, this has been Season 6, Episode 9, I believe, of Unlimited Opinions. I hope that's correct. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions, but I have been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.
Thank you for listening.